All right, you all, I give you the 2-minute overview of why we're having this meeting, and then I give you the charge for today, and then I get to introduce my friend Lynn Vavreck. So, to calibrate where we sit in our time and in our space as a country, I think we're at this moment where fiction is cheap and ubiquitous. And we see both foreign governments, but also trolls, consistently engaging in a kind of A/B testing to see which fiction will travel the fastest. But truth is really expensive, and truth is hard to produce. It's laborious. In an academia, truth requires peer review, and it requires careful study, so truth is slow. What this means is that fiction sometimes gets out ahead of us, and we are increasingly engaged in this informational war where we're fighting fiction and trying to find truth. I think in the space of elections, this has never before been more apparent with the consistent claims about fictions that, are messages and test. And we see both policymakers as well as election officials, as well as those of us who study elections, really fighting and fighting to try to elevate and make truth a little bit louder. This has enabled this crisis of trust, where we're increasingly seeing voters really not confident that their ballot was counted as they intended. And we're also increasingly seeing a crisis of trust among citizens regarding what universities do and what they're supposed to do. And it's why I think conferences like this matter so terribly much. Because a conference like this actually demonstrates to citizens everywhere that we're working on the problems of our age. We're working on some of the most pressing problems that we have and that we're listening. So we're listening to public officials who tell us these are the problems that are critical. Here is where we are stuck. And we're listening to a community of academics that say, all right, here are the evidence-based strategies that could restore citizen trust, that could work on these problems. This is the best work we can. And I think it's communities like this that let us fight against this incredible wave of fiction that we face. So I hope today what we see is emerging 3 different kinds of criteria, that we learn what the problems are, that we're listening pretty hard to say, all right, here is where we could restore citizen trust by working on these problems that are shared across communities around our country right now. That we could also listen very carefully to hear where is there evidence-based strategy that we can enable, that we can work on for our county election officials. And then arguably, perhaps most importantly, we can hear where there's work to be done. So where are we going to go as an intellectual community? Some of that may simply be in terms of communication. And I think it's a pretty exciting way to think about. It's communities like this that can both restore trust and enable this kind of democratic voice, but it can also enable people everywhere to have more trust in what universities are actually doing. I was really disappointed not to be able to meet you all in person, but one of the silver linings of this meeting is we have 100 people here today, and we couldn't have done that before. So I think we should really take the opportunity to celebrate that we're a much bigger community today, and we can actually arguably build up a body of knowledge from today's community to try to think about, like, where can we go forwards. I'm hoping our next meeting will convene again in a year, and we'll come to Wash U. So I'll welcome you all to St. Louis, and we'll do this again. In the meantime, I want to charge you again to look for 3 things: to listen to the problems, to listen for evidence-based strategies, and really to look for opportunities for work to be done. And I think, engaging in the chat, engaging in the Q&A, that helps us work out where we can actually make progress. So even though you're online, please be loud, please be noisy, please be chatty. My favorite thing about having a Zoom meeting is you can both listen to the presenter and ask a question at the same time, which in real life you cannot do. You have to wait to ask your question. But virtually, you can actually speak and listen at the same time, which is fun. So take advantage of that opportunity. And with no further ado, I want to introduce Lynn Vavreck. So Lynn Vavreck is the Marvin Hoffenberg Professor of American Politics and Public Policy at UCLA. She's famous. She is a remarkable human being. So she is an expert equestrian. She is an expert in polling and elections. But I think she's actually a perfect lead for today because she's great in crisis. So Lynn has been one of my mentors my entire career, and I will tell you a story about Lynn Vavreck, which is once I was at a conference where I caught the flu. I got profoundly dehydrated, and I had to go to the emergency room. Lynn Vavreck heard that I had been rushed to the emergency room, and she showed up. And I didn't even know her very well. I had met her for maybe, 6 hours beforehand. And she held my ponytail while I threw up, and she called my husband to make sure he was on his way. And I thought, if ever you are in a crisis, you want Lynn Vavreck with you. Well, I think this is the perfect woman to lead into today's meeting, because I think elections are in a crisis. And so I think setting the stage here for how it is that we can work and make progress. Well, Lynn Vavreck, she's here to hold our ponytail, but also to get us started on really working on some of these pressing problems. She's done a lot in her academic career. She's the author of 5 books. She's a Carnegie Fellow. She's written for The Upshot. She is the perfect person to lead us into today's conversation, who's worked at the intersection of talking to practitioners and talking to academics. So with no further ado, Lynn Vavreck.
Betsy, thank you so much. Hopefully this isn't a crisis, but I do appreciate the introduction, and thank you to the Lynn Center and Caltech. It's great to be with everyone today. Hopefully I'm not going to be the first glitch of this conference. I'm going to share my screen, and maybe Betsy, you can let me know if you guys are seeing.
Lynn, you're all set. Looks great.
Looks
okay, great. Perfect. Okay, so I am going to talk about the 2024 election and the nation's economy and people's personal financial situation and people's attitudes about those things. And I want to do that in the context of information and misinformation. And I want to raise a couple questions about those things. The first thing I want us to think about is levels of things versus changes in things. So we'll spend some time thinking about that. I want to think about 2020 as this looming moment in time that really structures what's happening in 2024. And then the big question, Betsy mentioned fiction versus truth. And I want us to think about what is fiction or misinformation and what is truth or information as it relates to the economy and presidential elections. And that, as you might imagine, is all going to be clouded by party identification. And in particular, this moment in time where we have rough even parity between the two parties in the electorate and people more strongly wedded to their party and thinking less of the out party. So that's the context of where we're headed. I'm going to try to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we're going to have a dialogue, and Betsy will facilitate that. Okay, so I want to start by just taking us back very quickly, a refresher on 2024. A lot has happened since November. And what I'm showing you here is just how close this election was, the outcome was. I've calculated for you, starting in 1952 and going to 2024, the number of votes in the Electoral College, but also in the mass electorate, that it would have taken to flip the outcome of presidential elections. And I've ranked them for you. And so you can see here that the closest election in modern times, since we'll call it the New Deal era, is that 2000 election that many of us will remember, 4 electoral college votes, 270 votes in Florida would have changed the outcome of that 2000 election. It's going to be hard for any contest to beat that one. Next, we move to 1960, 20,000 votes, and 76, also very close, Carter Ford, 23,000 votes. Then we get into this modern era. 2020 is the 4th closest election of the last 19, then 2016. 2024 comes in as the 7th closest with 114,000 votes in the mass electorate. That's across 3 states. So 114,000 votes across 3 states would have changed the outcome of the 2024 presidential election. When you think about it in that way, that's a close outcome. Now, at the same time that it was close, we all also know that the shifts happened almost everywhere. 89% of counties moved in the same direction, and that is away from the Democrats and toward the Republicans. So something caused this sort of sameness in the shift and this uniformity of where the shift happened. But sometimes we also know that those shifts were larger than the average. So in some communities, majority Hispanic counties moved, for example, in double-digit numbers. And we have all heard stories about particular segments of the electorate where the changes have been big, but always in that direction, away from the Democrats and toward the Republicans. So as I start thinking about how to make sense of this 2024 outcome, I'm looking for an explanation for those patterns that suggests something that might affect many people in many places in the same way. What could that be? And one of the things that we know always matters to election outcomes is the economy and people's evaluations of it. And I list those two things separately because I'm going to talk about them separately. And I want to convince you that those are two separate, I even want to say they're two separate concepts. They are certainly two separate measures. So let's start with what we know about the way that the nation's economy connects to presidential election outcomes. And what I'm showing you here is a figure that will be largely familiar to political scientists at the conference, but maybe not to practitioners. And so we'll talk through it here for just a minute. What I'm showing you here are all presidential election outcomes since 1952, again, that New Deal era. And I'm plotting on the horizontal axis the change in GDP in the first 6 months from January to June of the election year. And on the vertical axis, the incumbent party's share of the two-party vote. Each plotting symbol is the year. And then I've drawn a line of best fit through the plotting symbols. So a couple things should jump out at you right away. The first is that this relationship is positive, and it's pretty starkly positive. So what does that mean? That means that incumbent parties in growing economies typically win elections. Growing economies in the first 6 months of that presidential election year. Now, second thing to notice, not all the plotting symbols are close to the line. So there's noise here. Sometimes presidential candidates overperform their economy. These are incumbents in growing economies, overperforming. Sometimes they underperform their economies. Here's the global financial crisis. So it's a little hard to see, but this solid plotting symbol right here, the dot, that's 2024. And you can see GDP growth is positive. It's about 1.7, 1.8. So we have positive change in the growth rate of the nation's economy going into 2024, but we see the Democratic Party underperforming their economy. So we would expect, all else equal, them to be getting more than half of the popular vote in two-party vote share, and they get slightly less than half. 2020, close to the line. This is 2016, close to the line. So this relationship is robust to lots of different contextual changes. And in 2024, we see an underperformance of the objective growth. Now, I want to show you another objective relationship, one that we hear a little bit less about, but this is the same kind of thing, two-party vote share and objective economic performance, but now I'm showing you real disposable income on the horizontal axis. Again, you can see a positive relationship. Incumbent parties, when RDI is growing, typically win. So economic indicators tend to move together. So maybe this isn't a surprise, but the thing that I want to share with you about this figure is this number right over here, 2020. So the change in RDI in 2020, in January to June of 2020, is the highest that we've seen since the New Deal. This is COVID This is the stimulus package. This is all of the money that the federal government pumped into the economy, whether it be to help farmers or renters or landlords or small businesses or individuals and households. It really changed the average experience for people. And this is going to end up being an important factor in the story about 2024. So we're going to come back to this number as we go on. Okay, so what do we know about the economy over Biden's term, the actual objective economy? I've picked out just a couple of things. I've already shown you GDP, 6 months of the election year, positive, and RDI, I didn't actually point it out on the figure, but also slightly positive. So on those two indicators, the Democrats' term looks pretty good. Why didn't they win? So let's look at a few others. This is the inflation rate over Joe Biden's term in office. And you can see here, inflation creeping up after COVID, right? This is the post-COVID year. We get to 2020, and we have here the high point of inflation over the last 4 years. Now, then it starts to come back down. By the time we get to the election, we are about where we were at the end of the COVID year, at the end of 2020. So this is going to be one of these moments. We're going to see a lot of this where I ask you to think about the change is going in the right direction. That is, inflation is coming down. Okay, the number is still positive. And so people would prefer it not to be positive, but the change is in the right direction for the Democrats. But the level is maybe still high. So those previous two figures that I showed you, those were changes. And we typically, the robust relationship between the nation's economy and presidential election outcomes is about change. It's about, is the tide rising or sinking? Okay, so here we see the tide going in the right direction, but the level still positive. Okay, let's look at some actual costs of things. So what I've calculated for you here is over Biden's term in office, what does it cost to buy bread, gas, eggs, milk, and ground beef? And you can see the first thing to notice about this figure is all of the numbers are increasing. Everything costs more at the end of Biden's term in office than it did at the beginning. Some things had big changes. I realized when I was looking at this figure this morning, I should have done this in percent change, but you can sort of do the math in your head and see that eggs, I don't know what the story is with eggs, but at the beginning of Biden's term, and that is to say when Trump left office, eggs were about $1.50 a dozen. By the middle of Biden's term, we are paying close to $5 for a dozen eggs. That's an enormous change. Gas showing a similar pattern, though not as much change. So the real costs of things, what economists might call a basket of goods, is increasing for people over the course of the Biden presidency. Okay, so let's think about that in relationship to the economy post-COVID, pre and post-COVID. And I want to look at some more figures to help us do that. So these are data now from the Federal Reserve, home ownership rates in the United States. So that is the percent of people living in a home that they own. And you can see that this is now taking a more historical view, but I want you to see the buildup here from the 1990s going right up to the global financial crisis. So an increase in home ownership, everybody knows this story, and then decreases in home ownership during the global financial crisis. Okay, but then this, return to home ownership peaking during COVID and then coming back down after COVID. Right, so this COVID moment here is again going to be a moment. Whoa, sorry, did not mean to do that, everybody. It's good for me to know. Don't don't click on the graph. Okay, sorry about that. So this COVID moment is going to be an important moment of comparison for people. Homeownership comes down after COVID. And this is something that you hear sort of, people talk about vibes a lot now. You hear about this, that people cannot afford to buy homes. And so I want you to see where that homeownership rate is now relative to where it was in 2020 and how it was growing. If you look at the trend, right, leave out the COVID year, homeownership is sort of on trend to how it was doing before COVID, recouping the losses of the financial crisis. Okay, here's another one, credit card debt. So how much debt are people taking on? If people can't afford to buy things, we might expect to see more borrowing. And indeed we do. And here you can see that leading up to 2020, again, during the Trump years, we have middling levels of debt. Then during COVID, credit card debt and other forms of debt go down. Why is that? Supply chain issues, there's not a lot to buy, but also remember that RDI number. All that money that we put into people's pockets allowed people to pay off their debt. But then during the Biden years, we see the cost of things going up and we see credit card debt increasing. Okay, so this is all, I'm leading up to a story here about one of the things in 2024 that we heard was that people thought they were better off when Trump was president financially relative to when Biden was president. And lots of people in the Democratic Party and lots of people working in politics and lots of people who are allegedly objective observers of politics said that those people were delusional, that they were believing in fiction. And I'm trying to show some evidence here for why people in the mass electorate might have believed that they were better off from 16 to 20 than from 20 to 24. So what is myth, fiction, and what is fact or information? Okay, so people do tell pollsters and survey researchers that they think the economy is doing poorly, and they think they are worse off during the Biden years than during the Trump years. Okay, so now we're going to switch from objective indicators of the economy to people's attitudes about the economy. So this is from national exit poll data taken on election day and for early voters in the lead up to the election. And the first question I've got for you here is a question that asks about the voter's family financial situation. Is it better than 4 years ago, worse than 4 years ago, or about the same? And what you can see here is that 47% of voters told the exit poll that they're doing worse than they were 4 years ago, 29% about the same, 24% better. So a plurality of voters saying that their family's financial situation is worse. Those people largely voted for Donald Trump. The others largely voted for Kamala Harris. But here's the question on election night that came in from the national exit poll that made me realize very early in the day that it was going to be hard for the Democrats to win. And this question asked voters, in the past year, has inflation caused your family a severe or moderate hardship or no hardship? And you can see here that 3/4 of the electorate, 53-22, 3/4 of the electorate, a vast majority saying that inflation has caused their family a severe or moderate hardship in the last year. And those people are saying that they voted for Donald Trump. And that, for me, around 3 o'clock Pacific time on election day, was when I said, okay, wow, this is going to be harder for the Democrats than many people anticipated. Here's the same kind of question, but over a longer historical view. So you can see the change between the Trump years and the Biden years. This is Gallup data. Gallup has asked people is the nation's economy right now excellent or good, fair or poor? And the solid line is the excellent or good line. And so here are the Trump years, right? 60%, vast majority of people saying the economy was good going into COVID. Then COVID hits, and you can see the change. Now, all of a sudden, people say it's only fair, it's poor. For the whole of the Biden administration, people say they think the economy is doing poorly, the nation's economy. Okay, we see the same thing when Gallup asks if the economy is improving or getting worse. So now this is not about how it is right now, but is it getting better or getting worse? Again, is the tide rising or sinking? And you can see here during the Trump years, people think the economy is getting better. Then COVID hits, and for the whole of the Biden administration, people believe the economy is getting worse. Okay, so what's interesting about this is that it is not getting worse, right? We just saw bunches of objective economic data showing that the trends were improving, but that's not getting through to people. They are not feeling it. Okay, so here's another Gallup question. Is it a good or a bad time to find a job? And I'm showing you here the percent of people saying it's a good time to find a job, improving over the whole of Trump's administration, and then COVID hits. Now, it does come back roughly to where it was, but over Biden's term in office, people are saying it's harder and harder to find jobs. Okay, so again, levels versus changes. The change is going in the wrong direction for the Democrats. Even though the level did return to where it was, people are sensing that it's getting worse. Okay, so we have these misaligned impressions of the economy. The economy is good and it is growing or moving in the right direction, but people believe that it's bad and getting worse. And the question that I want us to think about is that misinformation? Okay, or is that something else, right? On average, improvement objectively, but on average, this attitude that things are bad and getting worse. So I want to ask, are objective conditions related to these impressions, and how are they related? Okay, so how can we do that? We're going to go to American National Election Study data, the longest collection of political attitudes in the world. Since 1980, the NES has been asking voters, do you think the economy is getting better, staying the same, or getting worse? And they ask them a whole bunch of other things too. And so I'm going to do something very simple here. I'm just going to correlate objective economic conditions in presidential election years, the first 6 months, to people's evaluations of the economy in the American National Election Study. 33,521 people have answered these questions about the economy in presidential election years. And they tell us that these things are positively correlated. That's good. Okay, that's good. There's some signal getting through to these evaluations. They are correlated at about 0.28. Okay, but it's not all good news, because there's some other measure in the American National Election Study that is more strongly related to evaluations of the nation's economy. And if we were all in the room together, I would ask you to shout out what that is, because I know you all know, and that is voters' party identification. So that is to say that your party identification is more strongly related to your evaluation of the nation's economy than the actual objective performance of the nation's economy in the 6 months leading up to an election. Okay, so what does that look like over time? So I'm showing you now data from YouGov, who YouGov does a weekly survey. And so I've grabbed all of those weekly surveys, sorted people by their party identification, Blue are Democrats, red are Republicans. And I'm plotting on the vertical axis here the change, the difference between people who say, the share of people who say the economy's gotten better relative to the share who say it's gotten worse. And I'm shading for you here presidential administrations. So during the Obama years, Democrats largely think the objective economy is doing well. The economy, I'm sorry, I should say, this is a retrospective question. In the past year, has the economy gotten better, worse, or stayed the same? During the Obama years, Democrats think the economy has grown week by week. Republicans think it has gotten worse. Then, as soon as Trump wins the 2016 election, those groups of people switch. So, this is weekly surveys. And just after Trump wins, now Republicans think the economy has gotten better, and Democrats think it has gotten worse, right? Especially around this pivot point, this is the same economy. So, people's partisan lenses are conditioning their answers to these questions about the nation's economy. And then you can see the same thing happens when Biden wins in 2020. We see the flip again. Democrats back to thinking that the economy has grown, and Republicans back to thinking that it has gotten worse. Okay, so again, I want to ask, is this kind of reaction misinformation? Is this fiction? This is the way that we often think about misinformation when we think about questions related to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, for example, or whether vaccines are safe. We see people's party identification coloring their answers to these questions. We call it partisan cheerleading at best, or we call it believing in conspiracy theories at worst. And just because this question is about an objective economic condition, should we think about this differently or not? Or does this lead us to suggest maybe we should think about those other things differently? Because party identification really is the lens through which people are at least answering these questions about policy topics. Okay, last thing I want to do, how much signal is getting through in these evaluations? So now I've just done something very, very simple. I'm going to take that economic evaluation from the American National Election Study, our 33,000 voters, do a simple linear regression on the three outcome categories, put in the actual change in GDP, and put in an indicator for whether you are a member of the incumbent party, whether you're an independent. And then I'll interact the objective indicator with those two things, just to get a sense of the recipe, if you will, for making up these economic evaluations. And you can see here's our positive relationship once again between objective conditions and evaluations. That's good. We like to see that. Being in the incumbent parties, being a member of the incumbent party, here's that bigger relationship coming through again. And in fact, if we kind of think about the relative size of these things, being a member of the incumbent's party seems to be worth about 4 points of GDP growth. That is a lot. So party identification is playing a very big role in people's evaluations of the objective economy as we go into presidential elections. Okay, so just to wrap up, the Democrats' problem in 2024 seems not to so much be the actual economy, so much as voters' attitudes about the economy. Now, for sure, I showed you that the prices of things are all going up. But remember that RDI number in 2024 is also going up. And so household incomes are growing on average. The cost of things are going up on average. But inflation is coming down. Sort of the changes do seem to be moving in the right direction. So why were the Democrats unable to change people's attitudes and help voters appreciate the objective economy? This is a very similar situation to 1992, an election in which George Herbert Walker Bush was unable to get people to appreciate the growing economy in what was then called a jobless recovery. We were coming out of the recession, but there it was unemployment. Jobs weren't coming back. And everyone remembers 1992 is what gave Bill Clinton the opportunity to coin the phrase that everybody uses now, that I've tried really hard not to say, it's the economy, stupid. And so this is hard. What the Democrats faced in 2024 is a difficult situation. I also have another part of my work is about messaging about the economy. We could have a longer conversation about whether the Democrats' messaging on the economy could have done anything to change these impressions of the economy. For sure, some of it is out party and how the out party is viewing the objective economy, the YouGov graph that we looked at a couple of moments ago. But in fact, I kind of want to go back to that graph to point out one thing to all of you. Look at the Democrat number here. So these are Democrats after COVID really showing. So we've looked at lots of different measures, different survey houses. Everything is showing us the same thing. Even in-party voters are saying that the economy is not working for them during the Biden administration. That's making it hard for the Democrats to message around the economy in 2024. Okay, so persuasion is hard. And my takeaway from all of this is that the real story of 2024 and the economy is not so much misinformation or fiction, but COVID. That COVID 2020 moment stands out because it makes the period after 2020 really pale in comparison to how the economy was doing before 2020. So 2024 is the second COVID election. And there was no messaging really about that. You heard Trump saying, I delivered you a booming economy. And sometimes he would say, and then COVID took it away from me. Every voter can relate to that. Their lives were going well, or at least moderately well, and COVID took that away. Biden didn't really message around COVID the way that Obama was able to message after the global financial crisis in 2012. We're coming back. We're still coming out of it. And Mitt Romney tried very hard to say that Obama promised you recovery. He hasn't delivered as much as he promised, right? I call that it's the counterfactual election. That's a very hard argument to win. But Trump had an actual presidency to hook back to. So he could just say, my years were better. And that was not fiction for most people. That was on average true in the population, making the Democrats' situation in 2024 a more complicated story to tell. How do we make sense of this in terms of political science? I'll throw out a couple of things to think about. Chris Aiken and Larry Bartels have work suggesting that this myopia of the electorate, the tendency of people to use the recent past only and not evaluate the longer term, is a weakness of the way voters evaluate politics. That may be one way to think about people only looking at the last year, and not considering way back to COVID and how that might have impacted the Biden years. Another way to think about it is in this classic kind of performance evaluation or retrospective voting sense, Fiorina, Key, Downs, that it does matter how the incumbent party has performed. The Janet Jackson question, are you better off or not? That people use these shortcuts and that the past is the best predictor of how this person will perform in the future. And on that very simple metric, the past under Trump's years, people have shown us the objective economy indicates was better than the past under those Biden years. And so these elections are close. it's complicated, but the way political scientists have thought about these things, I think really does give us purchase to make sense of this. And it isn't so much that fiction drove this outcome as it relates to the economy, unless we think that partisan lens is providing a bit of fiction. And Betsy, I'll turn it back over to you for questions.
All right, thanks. I have 10 questions for you.
10.
Yes. Are you ready? Okay.
I think I am.
All right. First question has to do with eggs. So, as you told us about the price of eggs, the chat chimed in and said, listen, are these real or nominal prices, Lynn? And moreover, is this just bird flu? What's going on with the price of eggs?
Okay. I'm hoping that there's someone who can tell us about the price of eggs. I do not know what's going on with the price of eggs. Those are real changes. So we could zero all that, put the price at zero and draw that, and it would all look the same. But
All
I
right.
can't tell you what's going on with eggs.
Post-COVID, eggs have been really expensive. Someone said in the chat that the price of eggs is really affected because markets are no longer subsidizing them as a loss leader. So it could, because of the supply chain issues. So it could be that. Um, uh, Thanks, Raquel, for your comment about increases in bird feed over time. Okay, so it's the economy, stupid. Why did it take so long for academics and pollsters to figure out that these were these core fundamentals? Was this wishful thinking? Was this mismeasurement? What happened here that we anticipated the election to be close and then it wasn't?
Okay, so the election was close. Um, that's sort of why I started with this is the seventh closest election of the last, 20. So it wasn't as close as people expected. That's true. And I think that that's a longer conversation about the way that polling as an industry is working through how to get more and more precise estimates of where we are, given we've entered this period of time where these elections we're on the knife's edge. Right. The misses, the polling misses are getting smaller and smaller, not in 2024, but as we move up to 2024, they're getting smaller and smaller. Pollsters are becoming better at this, but elections are also turning on fewer and fewer votes, which is putting the spotlight on them. Sometimes, even though they're doing this with more precision, they're ending up sort of by chance on the wrong side of the outcome because the band is getting narrower. So yes, the miss in 2024 is a little bit bigger than it was in 2020, but I wouldn't say this is a sort of a fundamental flaw of pollsters or polling. The election was predicted to be close. It was close.
Okay, I'm grouped a couple of questions here about
Okay.
misinformation versus information question, which is like paramount for the day. So a lot of this like lingers on like, is the economy actually good or bad? So in the subset of things, is it the case that that 0.28 correlation, you highlighted it's driven by partisanship. If we played Bullock et al. And we paid people to answer the question
Yes.
in these things,
Yes.
like would we see the same, like how would that affect the correlation in that space? So first, like, pay people for the right answers. Do people know the right
Right.
answers? They're just engaged in a grumpy answer. Um, in that space, then, is it that we're seeing a really small subset of voters who are answering slightly differently? So that like it's because you said it's very close. So what if it's just small? Are these just independents, for example? Like, that we
Mm-hmm,
don't think
mm-hmm.
of there being so many voters. And then this other like different question is just like, is there just a different relationship that voters have with the economy that we don't capture when we're thinking about is
Right.
the economy good or bad? So is it that for this small subset of voters who are persuadable, for them that inflation index is just paramount to their decision making? It is the price of eggs. Or is it that it's a kind of populism, it's a kind of consumerism that we're measuring the wrong economic indicators? So for some families, they are answering the economy is bad truly for them. And we're saying the economy is good because we're not seeing it.
Right. Um, okay. So three things. I do want to recommend the Bullock. I think it's Bullock, Hill, Gerber, Huber. I don't know. It's this is a great paper. And I want to recommend that to everybody. Betsy summarized it excellently. That if you offer people some sort of incredibly small benefit for telling you, quote unquote, the truth, many people will then take that benefit and tell you the truth, even though previously they were cheerleading for their party. So for sure, some of that is going on. I think that this is a great opportunity for someone, maybe a graduate student who's listening and looking for a project, to go and borrow that design and do something about this right now and see. This is I think, a more highly, I'll say, polarized time than when that article was written. And let's see if that result holds up. So yes, for sure, some people are just cheerleading, and they do actually know that especially when we see those flips, the YouGov graph again. For sure, people understand that they're cheerleading for their party. Second thing is, what does this mean for independence? And yes, that instinct is exactly right. Independents are more influenced by the objective economic signal than partisans. And so when we talk about election outcomes that are turning on 33,000 votes in 3 states, 77,000 votes, even 114,000 votes in 3 states, these are the voters at the margin that we're talking about all the time. People say to me a lot, like, oh, post 2016, is the economy irrelevant? No, the economy is not irrelevant. There are still voters at the margin. The margin has gotten a lot smaller, but these voters are still pivotal, right? The margin can be small and the people in it can still be pivotal if the two chunks of partisans are roughly in balance. And that is where we're living right now. And so, yes, independents are hugely relevant here. And the signal, the objective signal, does matter more to them. And then the last thing, are we just not connected to voters? We don't understand them. These are the wrong indicators. Okay, this is the question I like best, because this is where we can do some real measurement and conceptual work. I started with those two figures about objective economic performance and election outcomes, because that's a historical pattern that we can start with. Right. So going back to one of my favorite political science, well, it's just not really political science, scientific sayings, right? Models don't have to be right. They just have to be useful. So I think starting with those relationships is a productive place to start, because those patterns are robust, right? As social scientists, right, what's our job? We want to make sense of the chaotic world around us. We want to look for the patterns, try to explain them. That objective relationship between GDP change in the first 6 months and the two-party vote share, there's a pattern there, and that measure picks it up. Now, we could have a whole conference about what that means. Does it mean that people think a rising tide lifts all ships? Does it mean that it's performance evaluation, right? People disagree about this. Ray Dutch and Randy Stevenson wrote a whole book about it. So there's a lot of work to be done in understanding that pattern. And I think that this is something that should be very interesting to people who are election scholars, public opinion scholars, and interested in political behavior at this moment in time. So, going out and doing some real measurement work. How does the price of eggs factor into people's vote choice? If you had asked a political scientist this in the 1980s, they would have said, no, it's not about personal finance. It's not about your pocketbook. That is not how people evaluate presidents. They evaluate presidents based on the sociotropic, the nation's economy. Maybe that's not true anymore. We need to re-engage with that excellent work. Peasants versus bankers, the McCune, Erickson, and Stimson work, all that work from the 80s and 90s. And, that's a long time ago, Betsy. This is another thing that I'm often struck by. The 1990s is ages ago. And the electorate then and the electorate now, The overlap, not so much. So, re-engaging those kinds of questions about economic performance and economic evaluations, I think that that's also fruitful terrain.
Okay, that was a great answer, Lynn. So now I have
Passing my
a question.
comprehensive exams for Professor Sinclair.
Yeah, I give you check plus. All right.
Excellent. Okay.
So now I have some broader questions about trends. So the basic questions about inequality. So to the extent to which, what are people responding to inequality? In the narrative around comparative politics, we would say, like, to what extent does this lend ourselves to understand an international story about economic growth? So Danny Ebanks asked a lovely question, which was just like, did, in some sense, like the core structures that were growing in the economy, like staunch some of the democratic losses that we maybe would have expected given what people were answering? Do we see that reflected in international election returns? Some other, I think, really interesting questions are, to what extent do we see this modeled in 2022? So, like, why are the 2022 elections so very different? Thank you, Kostas. To what extent do we see the media, which is really a perfect question for you, like mitigating the impact of some of this and the narrative? And Joanne and Elizabeth, I'm going to save your question for just a minute. So I'm going to let Liz respond to that subset of questions, and then I'll ask the next subset. So, like, let's talk about like this in a comparative lens for just a minute here.
Sure. Yes, when I think about 2024 and obviously 2020, but 2024, there are obviously some trends that are happening globally, and not just economic trends. And so I think that, and I think that we're nowhere sort of, okay, maybe nowhere is an exaggeration. There's so much work to be done in understanding exactly how that happens. And is it media? Is it globalization? The more I think about this, the more I think that globalization is a very big part of all of these international trending, patterns, whether that's economic or on the social and cultural issues as well. And that means that to understand 2024, we do have to go back to, the 1980s, the 1990s, and understand the sort of slow change in how people relate their situation and what's happening in their place to things that are happening all around the world. The midterm elections, the midterms and presidential elections have always been different in terms of how they relate to the economy. Presidential elections, I just showed you about that relationship. In the midterms, the state of the nation's economy has an effect indirectly through the presidential approval rating. And that's sort of how we've always thought about this. So midterm elections are related to approval, and approval is largely driven by the economy. But when people are thinking about voting for the House and voting for the Senate, they're not bringing that same kind of economic consideration to bear on those candidates that they do bring to bear on the presidential vote choice. So we don't necessarily, we want to keep the institutional differences in the midterm versus presidential elections in mind as we try to make sense of how the economy is affecting people. The last thing, media, I had a figure on media coverage and I cut it. But as we've been making sense of this 2024 election, John Sides and I, with a couple of other people, we have been looking at media coverage of the economy, and it looks a lot like all those graphs I showed you, but particularly with coverage of inflation. The media coverage of inflation is going to go up and up and up and up over the course of the Biden administration. It's going to peak in 2022, just like everything else peaks in 2022, and then it's going to slowly start to come down. What's tricky about this, and I will say that John and I, we have big disagreements about this. This is one of the sources of our number one fight, is is it the objective economy, or is it the media coverage that's really getting through to people? Are the media covering it because it is getting through to people in their business and they have to, give people information about what they want? Like, I'm sort of on the side of, people feel these things, and the objective economy does get through to them, and the media is a market, and so they're sensing that. John is much more on the side of, if the media weren't covering it, people wouldn't be reacting to it. And so we have huge disagreements about this. And of course, the truth is obviously a mixture of both. For some people, it's one, and for some people, it's the other. But I do think the answer to that question is the media is probably culpable here, but they are not sufficient in driving these things.
Awesome. All right. So here's the big question.
Uh-oh.
I know it's the one. So like, what is the advice you give to campaigns? So there's a couple of things. So we're missing 1.2 million people. Thank you, Nina, for the workforce post COVID-19. We are seeing the economy growing. NVIDIA is doing great. SpaceX, Tesla, they're likely to grow. So are we going to see what will we expect in the next presidential election cycle? So what do campaigns do ahead of the next presidential election cycle? What advice would you give in terms of managing those elections? Should you be messaging about the economy? Should you be playing bullock at all and trying to get people to correct their misinformation? Should we be measuring other things? So given all of your work on messaging, what do you say, looking forward to campaigns, to say, like, what's your ground strategy and your ground game around the economy moving forwards?
Yeah. I want to thank whoever put this question in the chat. This is what I think about 24/7. This is, sort of what motivates me. And where I come down on this is this is a very simple statement that I would say to candidates. It is not 1930, it is 2030, right? The New Deal and the New Deal coalition of voters, and that dimension of conflict that politics has been contested on for most of our lifetimes, the New Deal, that is over. We're not going back. It is not going back. When Trump is out of office, we are not going back. We are a quarter of the way through the 21st century. People are still thinking and talking about politics like it's the 20th century. Like, we are a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and people have different problems now. So this idea of the role and size of government, what should the tax rate be? Should the government provide relief to people? Those questions, which motivated a large part of everything that's happened since the New Deal and motivated our politics, those are not the questions on which politics is turning, elections are turning now. So what are we talking about instead? We are talking about policies that are identity inflected. So that is not identity politics. Yeah, this is about policy. This is about writing down rules about who gets to have membership in our national community, who gets to call themselves to be an American. And then what does it mean to be a good American? Who gets to play on which sports teams? Who gets to use which bathroom? These are all questions on which policy will be written over the course of the next quarter of the 21st century. And everybody knows the party coalitions have changed. So just to, put a fine point on it, if you're thinking about running for president in 2028, what do you do with this? Well, if you're a Democrat, you're on the wrong side of a lot of those social and cultural issues. Public opinion is lopsided, and it is not lopsided on your party's side. So that is a hurdle. Now, on the economy, which we know is important to people, you have opportunities. And so the question I start with is, what's a 21st century economy look like relative to the 20th century? So what do we know? We know that everybody in the world, basically, but certainly everybody in America, carries around, a $2,000 computer in their pocket. You cannot get a job in America without a mobile device. You can't talk to your family. You can't keep track of things. You can't know how everybody is doing in a wildfire, whether your house is standing or not, right? Our telephones, these mobile phones, are hugely important. They belong in the basket of goods. Milk, eggs, yes, but the world is different. So, what kind of solutions can government provide to help people make these things affordable? As a share of, a household income, our digital connectedness is a huge share. We pay for internet. We pay to stream things. I have to pay to be able to Zoom with you today. Everybody thinks of these things as just costs of life and costs of doing business. You can't listen to music without streaming anymore. I mean, you can, but nobody does. So finding solutions to help make all of that more affordable. The way that the government stepped in the 20th century to provide electrification, to provide better roads, right? Solve people's problems. Those infrastructure problems still exist, but we have a whole new set of digital problems. Make that affordable to people. And so that would be step one is, I'm going to put New Deal in quotes, but the New Deal, right? How is government going to provide relief for people on this whole new set of things? Green energy, if this is important and this is where we need to be, then there needs to be government help to help voters understand that this isn't a burden, that the costs are not burdens on them. And I think candidates who can transition into that 21st century sort of New Deal. And then all the problems, Betsy, I'm going to end with this. Sorry, I'm talking so long, but all the problems that you started with in the very beginning of the conference, helping people understand that expertise is not bad. There's value in expertise. People seem to appreciate this with our rocket companies launching rockets day by day. No one wants me launching a rocket. They want the people who work, at Blue Origins and at SpaceX launching these rockets, at JPL, at Caltech. So people do understand this, but elites like us, experts like us, like we have suffered. And so just getting people again to value expertise, I think, is another thing that will be important but difficult work for Democrats in the upcoming cycles. There is a value in a college education, and experts can contribute to policy, to helping make policy outcome work for everyone.
Boom. That was a great answer, Lynn Vavreck. All right. Thank you for joining us today. We're
Thank you
going
for
to
having me.
rejoin together in 15 minutes. So everyone comes back together in 15 minutes, 10:15 sharp. I'm going to be a sharp timekeeper today. For those of you who ask, remember recordings are going to be available, so we understand if you need to drop off and drop back in. And we're gonna be here throughout the day. Questions went pretty well, so you can post questions in the chat. You can post questions in Q&A. I synthesized the questions for you if you want some extra material. Lynn's a pretty incredible resource, and we'll be having her in conversation with us for the rest of the day. So Lynn, thank you for an amazing talk.
Betsy, thank you for all of the kind words. I have learned that I should start my day every day by talking to Betsy. Thank you
I
all.
think
Thanks for
about
the
you
great
all the
questions.
time. That was like an amazing superhero moment for that conference. So yeah, Stephen Lewandowski, have a nice dinner break. And to the rest of you, we'll see you back in 15 minutes.
Thanks, everyone.